webinar of our online climate change awareness for SIDS course. Today, we will have the opportunity to discuss around climate resilient actions with our colleagues from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. We have been discussing around SIDS. We have been discussing around specific impacts of climate change. We have had webinars around impacts on specific sectors. And now this week is the opportunity for us to discuss around actions. What can we do for all this that we have been discussing? The presentation will be divided between several guest speakers. I will let maybe Margot to present each one of the guest speakers that we're going to have today, and then we can have the presentation. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a great presentation. We have some questions to ask, and it's going to be interesting overall. So from here, I think I will pass on to Margot from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Great, great. So it's my great pleasure to join this webinar and to join all of you here and all of you who might be watching this webinar later. My name is Margot Steenbergen. I work for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, and I'm the learning coordinator. And we've lined up a whole range of my colleagues, all working for the Climate Center. And I would quite like them to quickly introduce themselves as they start speaking. So perhaps we could start with Roop Singh. Roop, would you like to start your part?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Margot. So to introduce myself, my name is Roop Singh. I'm based in New York, and I'm the Climate Risk Advisor for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. So I'd also like to welcome you all to this webinar. So the way that this will work is I'll start with a quick introduction, walk you through the structure of the webinar, and then I'll pass it off to one of my colleagues who will then introduce themselves and walk you through the rest of the webinar. So first, I guess, is there a way for me to go to the next slide? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So
it should be able.
Yep, thank you. So just to walk you through the way this webinar is going to work, the first thing we'd like to do is talk about your experience. And then I'll pass it over to one of my colleagues to talk about the global frameworks in which climate resilience actions are housed. And then lastly, we'd like to talk about and spend most of the webinar talking about what you can do. So we'll talk about partnerships and networks, how you can engage in those, how you can engage in trainings and workshops, and then also how to address community risks using climate resilience actions. So to start off, I think one of the really nice things about climate resilience actions is that they're very personal and they're things that you can do yourselves. So what we'd like to do is start off by just sharing your own experience. So I'll start off and share my experience. So I live in New York, and in a part of New York that has been affected in the past by hurricanes. So one of the things that I do is when I know it's hurricane season, I very regularly monitor the forecast, and I also know one of the biggest risks for my area is usually wind damage and losing power. We're not in a flood-prone area, so I don't worry about flooding too much. So one of the things that I do during the hurricane season, if I see a forecast, is make sure that if there are any dead trees or branches or things that are likely to fly around, we make sure to bring those inside or make sure that the trees are taken care of before the hurricane season starts. So that's just a simple thing that in my personal experience, an action that I take that leads to better climate resilience. So now I'd like to hear from you about your climate resilience actions. So we're going to ask a poll question so you can tell us if you've ever taken a climate resilience action in the past, and then tell us what those actions are. So I'm wondering, can everyone see the poll question on the right side of your screen?
All right, thank you. Just to confirm that we can see it. Also, as a reminder, these questions will be also be posted in the forum discussion that we're going to have after this webinar. So everyone here that is listening, the record version, after you finish, I also recommend that you can join us in the forum and share your own experience.
So, Marco, just a quick reflection from my side. It seems that the poll is closed. Would you be able to reopen it?
Okay, thank you. So we're working with Alba, who is our technical advisor, and she will be opening the poll soon. Alba? Okay, it seems that we're having issues with the polling.
No problem. What I could recommend is if everyone can just quickly click on the chat arrow. So under the arrow where you see participants, there should be an arrow that says chat. And if you can just mention if you have an experience yourself with climate change adaptation, climate resilience action, you can just click, you can just type that in the chat box. So if everyone could just take a moment and type something in the chat box, that'd be great.
All right.
Excellent. So I see some people are typing, and I see someone has been involved in a flood preparedness drill where 100% of the community joined. Excellent. Anyone else, please do type into the chat, and I'll read out a couple of these. And of course, if you're joining us later, do tell us about climate resilience actions that you've taken in the forums. We're very interested to hear about them, and I'm sure it would be nice for your fellow colleagues to also learn about what others are doing. I see someone has supported the development of the Caribbean Climate Change Adaptation Toolkit. Excellent. So this is great. Do feel free to keep typing in the actions that you've taken into the chat bar. I'm just going to go on to the next slide as you do that and define a climate resilience action for you. So it's any action that helps people to deal with the negative impacts of climate change. So resilience action can be anticipatory. It can help you anticipate a negative action in terms of using a forecast to anticipate a flood, for example. It can also help you absorb the negative impacts of a climate shock, for example. So, for example, you might board up your windows if you're expecting a storm with a lot of wind speed. So that helps to make sure that you're absorbing that shock. And lastly, you might do something to adapt. So an adaptation action might be if you're realizing that the seasonal rainfall in the place where you farm is starting to come later and later in the year, you might adapt when you start to plant your crops. So those are all examples of adaptation actions that you can take. And I see that other people have also started to put in their actions. So it's really nice to be able to read what everyone else has done. So please continue to do that. And as we go on, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Jeno, who will talk about global frameworks. So Jeno, you're mute right now.
Can you hear us, Janice?
If you can click on the microphone button, it should unmute you, and you should be able to speak, Jeno.
We can hear you now, Shano.
Oh, okay, great. I'm laughing because I was typing, where is the button? So I wanted to come right in on this really helpful definition of climate resilience action, helping people to deal with the negative impacts of climate change. And I'd like to propose that we can actually expand that definition a little bit. Yes, we want to be able to anticipate. We want to be able to use the best available information, climate information, so that we can prepare. We also need to take action so that we can absorb negative impacts, so that we can live through the anticipation of future shocks. That the climate is changing. It means that we are not going to go back to any kind of historical future. We're going forward into a future that has a lot of unknowns, but also a lot of known unknowns, and we can prepare for those. We need to adapt. We need to change our way of working because our future is changing and our present is already changing. So part of what we need to do as humanitarians, as part of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, is also to advocate. And I would like to expand our definition of resilience to include not just dealing with the negative impacts of climate change, but also how can we learn to live with climate change in a way that reduces those risks that we can reduce, avoids those risks, of course, that we can avoid, but also that takes advantage of climate information in order to move us forward into a better future for all. Now, you may be wondering, how do we actually do this? Well, in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we're very practical, we're very operational. And the IFRC, the International Federation, has actually come up with a draft framework for climate action, looking forward towards about 2020. So this is it's a short-term framework, and it's addressing this new climate reality. Climate change really affects almost every aspect of our work. The science is really clear, and we're not going to focus so much in this section on the science. We're really going to look at what can we do about it, and why do we need to be involved in global frameworks, policy frameworks, and what do those big global policy frameworks have to do with what we're doing on the ground right now? Well,
Shano,
yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just very quickly, if you see these arrows at the top of your screen, can you move them right to advance your PowerPoint?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Fantastic. I can't move them from here.
Oh, here we go. Okay. So here we are. Our strategy 2020 is as I said, it's a very practical framework. Our vision is for communities around the world to be more resilient to climate variability, which is what we experience right now in the immediate term, to be more resilient to weather extremes, which we are experiencing and we can expect to continue, and even to become more frequent or more extreme under a changing climate, and to be better prepared for the impacts over the longer term. So it's reducing the impact of climate change and extreme weather events on vulnerable people around the world, which is our core mandate. I would say that addressing climate change and variability is emerging right now in the global IFRC meeting taking place in Turkey, where all the national societies are coming together. And this approach to resilience and disaster risk reduction is part of a strategic aim, which is really to enable healthy and safe living. It's addressing the negative impacts, but we also want to really focus on how positive living with climate change can be. And this brings us back to how we relate the strategic vision for 2020 to global frameworks. And what do we mean by global frameworks? Well, we have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which we could think of as how do we address the impacts of climate change in the immediate and near term? How can we anticipate, absorb, and adapt in the near term? We advocate for the needs of the most vulnerable, and we look at the medium to longer term as more of a moving towards anything from about 30 years out. We would be saying that we're looking at changing climate impacts. What can we anticipate to be different from what we experience today in the future, and how can we address that in a way that we don't create more problems in the future? So when we're recovering from a disaster, how do we build back better? This is where adaptation becomes so important. But we have guidelines. We also want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. Many of the Sustainable Development Goals relate directly to climate change adaptation and to disaster risk reduction. And I'm just going to say that the relationship between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, we can think of in simple terms as in many respects, they're the same. Sometimes there are differences, but it's more an issue of the time scale. We do disaster risk reduction in the short term, and we do climate change adaptation in the longer term. The Sustainable Development Goals, in a way, are this bridge from disaster risk reduction, preventing, avoiding, and better preparing for negative impacts of climate change, but looking towards a future where we can live with climate variability and we can live well. Our goal is the well-being, the prosperity even, of all people on this earth. And the Sustainable Development Goals include many nature-based solutions. Why are nature-based solutions so important? Well, some of the most serious impacts of climate change are threatening our food security, which is intimately connected to our livelihood security, and things like eco-DRR are emerging in the current climate talks as very important themes that effectively enable us to begin to formulate a vision of a future that involves not just reducing negative impacts, but taking better advantage of the climate information that we have in order to live well. So because we're about to go right into the 23rd climate negotiations, known as COP23, happens every year. It's an annual process led by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, taking place in Bonn. This year it's actually led by Fiji, a small island country, but it's hosted in Germany because it would be difficult and burdensome to bring the world to Fiji to have these climate talks. But we have a role as humanitarians that I would say is becoming stronger and stronger in evolving a clearer and clearer definition of what resilience means. So going back again, I want to underline Root's definition to anticipate, absorb, adapt, and add this advocacy element, because this is how humanitarians engage in these global frameworks, which I'm connecting for you. So disaster risk reduction under the Sendai framework, climate change adaptation under the Paris Agreement. This involves national adaptation plans that humanitarians can become involved in, that we can advocate for the needs of the most vulnerable. We can advocate for taking resilience building action at the community level to scale. We can advocate for channeling investment to be able to take resilience building action to scale. There are also the nationally determined contributions. This has a lot to do with mitigating the causes of climate change. But did you know that in the Caribbean, I think 17 out of 21 nationally determined contributions, these are the commitments that governments are making to reduce the causative contributions, the emissions, the carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, the land use changes that cause climate change. And those involve DRR measures. They involve adaptation measures. So it's going to be increasingly important for the humanitarian sector to understand these policy processes because we have such an important role to play. Under the Paris Agreement, there's something called the Marrakesh Partnership. Marrakesh in Morocco, which hosted the last climate talks. And this partnership involves a number of events and platforms, but it's been part of an organizing team for several high-level events at the COP23 in Bonn that are related to resilience. One on investment, one on nature-based solutions, and then there's a high-level roundtable on why climate resilience matters, looking at challenges, looking at solutions, especially for building the climate resilience of people living in small island developing states and other vulnerable countries. In other words, the people who live in coastal and island states are largely on the front lines of dealing with the effects of a changing climate. So the goal of this process in terms of key policy messages for COP23, as humanitarians, we want to reach the most vulnerable people, ensuring that within global and national decisions and plans, that the needs of the most vulnerable to climate change are considered. We also want to increase finance for adaptation and for resilience to strike a balance with the finance that is largely today committed for mitigating the causes of climate change. We need to bring at least up to par the investment in adaptation. We also want to ensure the role of local actors in climate action. How can we enable this role, including promoting decentralized access to climate finance? It can't be too complicated, it can't be too difficult for communities, which are where the transformational change in building resilience is taking place, to access the necessary, flexible, adequate financing to build resilience. Lastly, we want to implement integrated risk management approaches to building climate resilience. We need to bring coherence across the humanitarian, development, environment, disaster risk reduction, and climate change agendas from the local to the national level. So in summary, I'm hoping that I can help all of you to engage proactively and more confidently in whatever level of involvement you can bring to your national processes in respect to these big policy frameworks, to understand what our role is in community action on the ground, contributing to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. It may indeed be the same actions which also contribute to longer-term climate change adaptation under national adaptation plans. There can be support actually under the nationally determined contributions, the NDC framework that governments are formulating. And lastly, in terms of achieving sustainable development goals, the humanitarian sector has an enormous contribution which we are making, but we may not be making as explicitly as we could be. We need to be engaging in broader partnerships across these development, environment, climate change adaptation communities, building new kinds of partnerships so that we can bring in the information, the technical information that we need to be able to understand and implement based on climate information is one foundation. Understanding nature-based solutions is another important foundation where we need partnerships. And I think that this is a good segue to our next section, which is looking at partnerships. Here's our summary of our global frameworks. And I'd like to turn it over now to talk about partnerships and networks.
All right. Jano, thank you very much. I believe everyone can hear me. I think I'm going to switch to the video, if that'll work, just so I can say hello to everybody. Unfortunately, this is my first time joining as a facilitator, so I'll properly introduce myself. My name is Andrew Kuskevich. I work as a climate researcher at Columbia University in New York at an institute called the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, also known as IRI. But I spend about half of my time supporting the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center as science advisor, working on various different projects, exploring different aspects of climate risk. Yeah, and I'm very happy to be here today with the group in talking about something very important. Basically, yeah, what is the relationship between partnerships and networks when we're talking about building resilience? And first, I'd like to thank Roop and Jano for building a strong base for the discussion and talking about some of the important elements such as anticipate, absorb, adapt. Jano added advocacy to the equation for us to better get a sense of what we're talking about when we mean building resilience. How do we know that we're moving in that right direction? Yeah, but to pivot a little bit and to think about, yeah, like if we're going to move forward in doing that, what are the important first steps? Who do we invite to the table? Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's just a second there.
Hello?
I think again.
You want me to shut the video off, maybe? Would that help?
Yeah, I think that will alleviate a little bit the bandwidth.
Okay. Okay, well, at least now everyone knows what I look like in case you need to reach out. I'm assuming the sound is better now. I will move a little bit closer to the microphone. Okay, great. Okay, so let's see. So the partnership and networks. Yeah, and I wanted to start off with an example of a very personal example because it's an example that my position captures. So as I introduce myself, I am a climate researcher at Columbia University, supporting the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. So right there was a need. How did this partnership come about? How did it grow? Well, a few years ago, I think about 10 plus years ago, there was a need to understand climate variability and change within the Red Cross movement. So identifying one of the groups that was at the cutting edge of this sort of research, understanding climate change, understanding El Nino, understanding how different hazards, floods and droughts may shift over time, the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center reached out to Columbia University and said, listen, let's try to establish a partnership. Your team has the research and has the mandate to apply that research, and we're an organization who wants to put that research into action. So right there was a natural progression towards a partnership, but it takes time to grow these things. But just identifying that there's a group that's producing something that can support another group, maybe your own group's efforts, is one of the key points of thinking about who might be part of this network. Where are there co-benefits within the actors that, one, we may already know, two, perhaps organizations that we worked with in the past, and maybe that relationship has been muted over the past few years. Maybe that could be reinvigorated in some ways. And thirdly, maybe there's new organizations that are being founded on these ideas of climate change, climate risk, building resilience. And these are, I think, one of the first steps in thinking about mapping out who needs to be part of this discussion, is just thinking about that. What are the current networks? What were the past networks? And then maybe some of these new opportunities that are coming up. Let's see if I can move this forward. Here we go. So yeah, so this slide showing a very simple schematic of how to build a network. And I really like the first box on the left. Identify the relevant climate change impacts. So I think Rup and Jeannot did a great job at unpacking this idea of impact a little bit more. The idea of, well, a hazard could happen. We could have a hurricane approaching an island, but different parts of the island will be impacted differently. You know, we might have very heavy rainfall across all of an island, but maybe flooding only happens in a few communities. Why does the flooding happen in only a few communities? That's a very good question, and it could be for various reasons. But identifying the specific impact, so wind damage, as Rup presented an example that was close to her. Flood damage, flood impact, something that disrupts a community, disrupts the livelihoods within a community. Trying to narrow it down as much as possible in some context to get an idea of who needs to be part of that discussion, who needs to be invited in. And then having that brainstorming, thinking about that, is one of the first steps or first group of steps that allows the network to be built, or at least to be discussed about how to move forward with building up a network and including the relevant stakeholders within. Let's see. So key partners, and after I review some of these key partners, I'm going to present an example or two of my own personal experience. But yeah, scientific community. So scientific community, yeah, I include myself within that space. So university departments, correct? So my university department focuses on different time scales of climate risk. So what I mean by time scales, I mean not only climate change, so things are happening over a long period of time, but also shorter term time scales like El Nino. When we see El Nino, or now we're in La Nina, we'll have shifts for a shorter period of time, a few months maybe. But then there's other scientific institutes. I know in the Caribbean, there's CIMH, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology in Barbados, and also the University of West Indies. They have a few campuses there, but also National Meteorological Services. And this is an important entity to keep in mind. But I would like to expand on the National Meteorological Services point here, because there's other organizations, depending on the structure of the government, which varies from country to country. Sometimes the National Meteorological Service are the people that are going to be issuing, let's say, flood forecasts. But sometimes that's not the case. Some countries have National Hydrological Services. And unfortunately, sometimes those offices may even be in a different building or city than the National Meteorological Services. But just doing a little bit of research, maybe even asking around, asking a simple question, after identifying the impact, so if we're focusing on, let's say, flood impact from hurricanes, asking who is the group that's responsible for producing those forecasts would be a good question to circulate to get an idea of who needs to be part of that discussion. So then government too, that's a nice segue into government, formalized in international and national agreements. So I think this, when I see international here, I kind of think back to some of the discussion, some of what Jeannot was talking about, but I'll also interpret this international as more of a regional perspective. Perhaps there's regional groups like CIMH that may add value to this discussion. Private sector is a great one here. And maybe some of the participants are looking at this and say, private sector, like, wow, I wouldn't necessarily think of that. And you know what, I would be in that same category a few years ago, thinking about, wow, what will the private sector add to this? But things are changing pretty rapidly. And the idea of public-private partnerships is presenting the opportunity for private sector to engage more with in a various set of activities, let's say. There might be, let's say, for example, sometimes insurance companies are keen to discuss the needs of a group, perhaps like the Red Cross, to see how their products could potentially support resilience building activities for free. That may not always be the case, but perhaps there is an opportunity there to work with or engage with private sector companies to make a difference. So communities again, and I'm very happy that this was discussed in the beginning, because identifying the most vulnerable usually, if not always, involves being involved with the community and understanding the decision-making and planning processes. Sometimes this is difficult, and sometimes other organizations that maybe the perception is they have an understanding of the most vulnerable, such as the National Meteorological Service, sometimes that's not the case. And I'm going to share an example of that in just a few moments after we get through this key partners. So international agencies, again, useful online resources in their country and regional reps. So I'm guessing this is, my interpretation of this is like UN agencies and perhaps even the World Bank, Red Cross Red Crescent movement. So again, this is where I think where the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center falls into this category. And we have many opportunities and many resources on our website that I'm sure have been shared and will be continued to be shared that provide some valuable resources, and also the facilitators like myself here are available to answer questions and continue the conversation. So I think I'm going to move forward to this slide here, which is why link with the Met Services, and I think this is a good question. First, what I want to do is I want to return to the note that I made before when I said, well, the hydro services are important too. So I think it is best to think about this question in the context of both why link with the meteorological services and also why link with the hydrological services. But moving past that, let's just stay with the current question. Yeah, and basically why? It's complicated. It's not easy. I mean, sometimes when we think about climate change, there are some ideas that are easy to communicate. Temperature is likely to rise. But when is it likely to rise? Is it going to rise uniformly, so equally everywhere that we're interested in? Is the temperature going to rise in the next few months, the next century? I mean, these are questions that the national climate change focal points within your country are valuable resources for. And I understand that maybe just saying link with the Met Services is also a difficult, well, or I should say it's easy to say, but then what are the steps in doing that? And I think these are some of the other questions that here at the Climate Center we're willing to support in order to, I guess, help prepare someone for venturing into the National Meteorological Services in order to have a productive conversation. Yeah, because it's hard to think about, like, well, what questions do I ask? If we were linking with the Met Services, what does linking mean? Does it mean just making it known that the Red Cross is interested in receiving forecasts? But then if forecasts, what kind of forecasts? Do we only want flood forecasts? Do we only want climate change projections? So, I mean, this slide is I think a bit complex, but the main takeaway of this slide is saying that things are changing over different time scales. So there's that word time scales again. And one of the biggest challenges with this is that if we look on the left-hand side of this slide, we see that there's more time to reduce risk. So if we have longer lead times, if we're talking about like decades or the year 2100, we have a lot of time to do stuff. But there's problems. The problem is that the information is more uncertain. So we're less confident about the information on the longer lead times. And that's the tricky thing to balance. As we go farther out, as we talk about farther away periods, the information becomes less specific and less confident. That doesn't mean we can't do anything. And with discussing with the right partners, engaging with the right partners, which are within your network, or could be within your network, we could have a better idea of what to focus on, and also get a better idea of the confidence of these projections and these pieces of climate information. And on the right-hand side, just quickly, you could say that at shorter lead times, so 10 days, when we have a shorter period of time to react, we have less time to reduce risk, but the trade-off is we have more specific information. So 3 days away, if a hurricane is forecast to hit, to cause impact 3 days from now, we'll have a better idea of where that impact may be relative to a 10-day forecast. You know, when a storm is far out east and approaching and set to have impact 10 days from now, there's more questions, is basically what this slide is showing. So where did collaboration work well? So I think this is a good question and something I think we could open up for the group. But I could just share one example quick. And it has to go back to the community component of what we're trying to do in order to identify the most vulnerable and build resilience at the community level. So in Malawi in 2015, there were very impactful floods. And after the floods happened, the Red Cross and also the Malawian government, this Department of Disaster Management, wanted to figure out where to take action first. There was limited amount of resources for the first 2 weeks before they got more resources, and they were trying to figure out where do we prioritize. So to do this, the National Meteorological Service was brought in, and flood maps were accessed. And as a collaborative effort, the National Meteorological Service, the Department of Disaster Management, the Malawian Red Cross, and also some UN agencies were there as well, World Food Program. They looked at these maps, and they tried to decide where to send resources first. There was a problem with the maps, though. The flood maps did not indicate impact. They just indicated where the water was. So Malawi, this part of Malawi that was flooded is a long valley, very flat. And some places where there's water, it's not that big of a deal. Other areas, if there's water, there's disruptions in people's lives and there's great impact. So it was a good example of how these different organizations work together using different areas of expertise to create a map which showed which areas were likely to have been impacted most. So the government, Malawian government, the Malawian Red Cross took the lead at saying, well, you know, just because we have water in this area, there's no community there. But this other area where we're seeing water, that's also an area where we know the most vulnerable people live. So maybe we should prioritize response in that area first. So I will leave it off from here. Maybe Margot, do you want to, let's see what we have here. Okay, so Margot wrote the question, thank you. If you have an example of a collaboration that's worked well, please type it here. Yep, I think it would be really interesting to hear about example of collaborations that have worked. But also if you have an example that maybe there were some challenges, I think that could also be something that we could learn from. So thank you very much for your time and looking forward to following up.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. And I know Andrew has unfortunately got to leave us, but over the next few days he might be able to type his answers to any of your questions. And please do ask questions related to these linkages, because we do have a lot of experiences from various countries in the world. And it doesn't matter if the question is really, really simple or complex, we can always try. The next part is for Bridget. Marco, could you give Bridget the speaking rights and she'll be able to move the slides forward?
Yeah, she should be able to do it now.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Margot and Andrew. And just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Bridget Rodram, and I work for the Climate Centre on interactive learning and uptake for climate resilience, specialising particularly on youth engagement. And I'm based in the UK but work regularly in Haiti, so it's really great to be part of the session today, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be involved. So leading on from the discussion so far, I just move the slide. I'm going to be discussing trainings and workshops for building climate resilience. And I wanted to start the session with two general questions. Firstly, asking, why do you think trainings and workshops are important? I'll just type that into the chat. Any general insights or opinions? Okay, yeah, so we've got a few answers coming through to make sure people have a basic understanding or starting point to start talking about and dealing with climate change. So yes, we can use trainings and workshops to learn specific content, to share knowledge and ideas, to discuss opinions, or perhaps to advocate for a new event, for a new agenda, or to collaborate with new partners like we've discussed in the previous session. And then my next question to start this session is, I'd like you to think about one positive learning experience from your own life recently. And this can be anything, so something from work or outside of work, and think about what made this experience, this learning experience, successful. So I'll just type that into the chat as well. Okay, so we've got one answer saying, I recently did a training course and had a study group which supported me for many months. And that's a great starting point. So in terms of successful learning experiences, there's the support element to it. So the learner having the support of a mentor or a study group that's patient and supportive and nurturing the learning. And perhaps leading on from that, we can also talk about learning as an individualized aspect. So there can be standards for the learning, but a learner can also meet these in their own way. What other answers have we got? And the personal connection was really helpful. So that's the personalized idea of individualizing learning. And we've got some other responses coming through in terms of content. So content being personally relevant as well as interesting, useful, or perhaps meaningful to the learner. And that's particularly important when we're talking about resilience building. And that work is well connected to other ideas and to the real world. And I think we've also got a few comments coming through in terms of methodologies and the training experience, which is something we'll talk about more in this session, in terms of interactive learning, experiential methodologies, and also giving the learner choices in terms of responsibility in the learning and opportunities for peer-to-peer learning. So to learn from others in the workshop and to share your own knowledge through interactive approaches and small groups. A few other responses coming through in terms of practical things and not just learning about theory. Other common criteria of effective learning environments are often having an emotional aspect to it. So something that's fun about the learning experience or something that leaves the learner feeling good. And that links to outcomes as well. So the learner feels accomplishment with achieving something, particularly if it's a challenging concept or piece of work. And a really great learning experience promotes further learning and engagement. So when we're talking about, when we're talking about resilience building and resilience in action, what topics do we want to start thinking about in our trainings and workshops? So I've asked those two general questions because it's key to think about the generalized criteria of a strong learning environment, and particularly when we're talking about resilience as a relatively new and evolving topic. And when thinking about specific topics to cover for action on resilience, this will of course depend on the context and the best starting point for that context. It may be that you want a training that's very content focused to learn about a specific topic, for example, to gather and understand scientific data on climate change. And then you want to think about some of those partners Andrew was talking about in the previous session. Or perhaps you want to hold a workshop to share ideas and initiate a collaborative working approach on climate-related issues with experts or perhaps government ministries and other players in the field. And similarly, workshops can provide a forum to begin working towards an integrated approach, perhaps with across your own national society. And trainings and workshops can also be a great starting point for awareness raising and communicating a topic. For example, on the slide here, we've put the main climate risks to key actors, such as Red Cross staff and volunteers, youth and communities. But even with an awareness raising agenda on a clear structured topic, we still want to be thinking about the interactive and two-way knowledge sharing within your training and workshop. Or trainings and workshops can also provide a space to discuss an agenda and advocate for a wider adoption of a specific resilience action. So we've put an example here as making more use of relevant short-term and longer-term weather forecasts to enhance better preparedness in both health and care and disaster risk management. So you've thought about your topic, but whilst deciding on your topic, at the same time, you should also be considering the key actors and who should participate in your training and workshop. And again, this links back to the previous discussion, thinking about stakeholder analysis and developing partnerships. And this is, again, especially relevant when we're thinking about workshops on climate resilience action, in that resilience is inherently it's an interdisciplinary topic. And so to effectively explore an interdisciplinary subject is going to require interdisciplinary input and ideas. And this can mean having a range of participants from across different sectors, as well as a diverse representation of people from a specific area. And this aspect of workshop planning, though, can also require considered thought for the specific context. So, for example, there may be different ideas on best practice approaches and methodologies to resilience building or local climate change action planning across organisations. And in some circumstances, it could be advantageous to hold a workshop or training to bring together a diverse group of participants from the outset to discuss resilience agendas. In other circumstances, it may be more effective to have preliminary workshops with different groups of people or sectors to explore ideas and then bring them together in a slightly later session. So it requires thinking carefully about the context and the best approach to your specific objectives within the resilience building agenda. And in some contexts, this aspect of workshop building can require some context-specific sensitivity. So hence, as mentioned before, the first step really is a stakeholder analysis to identify partners in terms of both national and local climate change experts. And when we're thinking about experts, from this diverse perspective, we want to think about experts in the broadest sense of the word. So they can be anyone with specialist knowledge relevant to resilience building that you want to engage in your workshop or training. For example, including climate scientists, Met Office, governments, climate finance specialists, communities, farmers, extension workers, NGOs. It's exploring that diverse range of expertise relevant to your training on resilience. Into the next one. So now you've got your topic and your participants for your training and workshop. You now want to think about what the best approach to communicating your objectives and generating engagement, discussion and ideas. And in that first question, there were mention of interactive approaches and hands-on practical approaches. And that area is something that the Climate Centre strongly recognises the importance of. And hence we've invested time and experience in developing a range of interactive methodologies to discuss and learn about resilience. And one of these key resources is our Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre training toolkit, which I'd really recommend you to have a look at on our website. And it's divided into key topics in a logical sequence, and each topic is organised so as to be user-friendly with presentations, exercises, activities, quizzes, games, and so on to meet learning objectives of that specific topic. So please do have a look at that, and if there's more questions on the resources there, we'd be very happy to discuss those further. Another quick example of resources, interactive resources for resilience, for training trainings and workshops on resilience, is our new programme YADAPT, which is developed by the Climate Centre in partnership with Plan International. And it's an exciting 7-session curriculum for youth and focuses on learning engagement to inspire young people to take action to adapt to climate change and build resilience in their communities. And it's based on games and playful activities. Each session has clear objectives and real-world goals, in this case drawing on key content from the VCA. And again, that's on our website with the facilitation guide and the resources, taking you through the different sessions within YADAPT, aiming to engage and inspire youth to take action. And again, I'd be very happy to talk through that in more detail if there's interest after the sessions. And then just quickly, finally, there's lots of other interactive resources, again accessible on the website, that you may want to look at when you're developing a training or workshop to add an interactivity or an engagement angle to your workshop methodology. And so I've put 3 examples here on the slide. Paying for predictions is an example of a really clever but simple game to get people to start thinking critically about decision making in a changing environment. And this is a great example of a way to introduce and discuss the importance of forecasts. And there's lots of different games with different objectives that you can have a look through for different topics that you might be focused on. The example below that is our greenhouse gas game, which comes from the YADAPT curriculum. And that's a nice example of taking a scientific concept, the greenhouse effect, and simulating it through a game-based methodology. And in that picture, you can see some of the children playing greenhouse gases on the circle, which represents the atmosphere, and some of the children running in and out of the circle representing heat from the sun. So it's a really simplified way of initiating discussion on relatively complex scientific concepts. And on the right-hand side, just finally, we've got an example of some of the really innovative approaches that the Climate Centre gets involved in for training and workshops. And that is an example of a flash mob in India, raising awareness on what you can do to protect yourself from heat waves. So that's just a quick kind of run through of steps in terms of planning a training and workshop, thinking carefully about the topic, the participants, and then how you're going to make your workshop interactive and engaging to really initiate discussions, engage your participants, and end with a desire for learning more and hopefully taking action to build resilience in your community. So I think I'll leave it at that, but please do ask any questions and please have a look at the resources as well. We'd be very happy to talk further on that topic. And I will pass you over to Margot, who will now talk about addressing community risk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bridget, and thanks to all the presenters so far. And I think we've taken quite a path from the beginning. So we've really started from the definition of climate resilience actions, going through flying through the global landscape, what big policies are in place and how can we contribute to them meaningfully. How do we link with partners such as the Med Service, which is difficult but very, very valuable as a Red Cross Society? And then how do we engage with others, get that interest flowing, and actually get people to understand and engage through trainings and workshops by finding the right topic, finding the right participants, and then communicating these topics in a way that sticks. And we've come to the last part of this presentation, which is around addressing community risks. Now, I realize we've gone over the time a little bit, so I would like to take you through a few of the steps of how to do that. There's not so many participants present at the webinar anymore, but for those of you who are present, can you type here in the chat box why you think it is relevant to address community risk? Why should we bother? And in the meantime, as you are typing that, and it'd be great if a few people could give some examples of why you think this is relevant. I'll just quickly reintroduce myself. So I've been working for the Climate Centre for the past 2 years. And before that, I worked for the Netherlands Red Cross for several years. And out of that, I was based in the Philippines for a few years, directly working on resilience programming on the ground. And that included risk assessments, making risk plans, and all that sort of thing, which I'll be talking you through right now. Okay, so if you have an idea about why we should be addressing community risk, feel free to type it in the chat box, and then I'll continue. So very briefly, I just wanted to go back to this overlap between DRR, disaster risk reduction, and CCA, climate change adaptation, that Jana already introduced at the start. So what Jana said rightfully is that there's a big difference in time frame between the two. Climate change tends to think about things that might happen a long way from now, but we know that certain impacts we can already start to see now, and disaster risk reduction deals with what's actually happening now, but there's a massive area of overlap. Another thing, if people do ask you questions of the difference, and it might have come up in one of the other modules, but disaster risk reduction does look at earthquakes and volcanoes as well, which are more geophysical hazards and not meteorological hazards. And it might include conflict or traffic accidents as well, which climate change adaptation doesn't. But for the most part, we do talk about something about addressing the risk which comes nicely together in climate resilient actions, and just seeing how we can practically deal with this. So in the meantime, I've seen a few answers here. Ruth mentioned that addressing community risks helps us make sure we can anticipate where there might be disaster impacts and reduce them before the disaster happens. Yeah, that's great. So that really speaks to the element of anticipation that you actually introduced earlier during this webinar. And someone else mentioned that the communities are already experiencing the risks of disasters, and actions are being made to reduce such risks. And it only makes sense to use the CCA approach to ensure that not only current risk is addressed, but also the future risk. Now, that's a really, really interesting element that I'll get back into more later. So what's a good starting point for all of this? A very good starting point is to talk to local experts. We've received stories from all over the world where people are talking about the weather patterns changing. People talk about funny weather, and that could be relating to temperature or rainfall, and especially for those people that are dependent on rainfall for their income, such as people such as farmers, or other people who do notice very much what is happening with the weather patterns. A good place to start is with our community elders, who do have a lot of experience, obviously, in what the weather used to be like and what it is like now, and even just having that simple conversation with your elders, with people in your community, sitting around and discussing what are the changes we can actually observe. This gives us an idea about what has happened in the past. So we just saw in one of the comments.
and the effects of these changes are currently being felt right here.
I hear someone coming through. Sorry, I don't know if that was on purpose, but if so, if the person who would like to share their experience could introduce themselves and share that experience, or just briefly type it in the chat message, that'd be great. So what you see in this picture is this gentleman says there's more and more floods here, the rains are no longer normal, and that is typically a conversation you can be having with people in your community. But you should remember that communities do face many challenges, and climate change needs to be considered alongside. So one of the things I have observed in the past few years is that once people start thinking about climate change, everything becomes climate change. So I was in the city somewhere before where people said it's so dirty on the streets, people are throwing away their rubbish, I can't walk through the street without it being dirty because of climate change. And that's a bit of a complex link to make. So do think carefully about what are all the different issues that can happen. It could very well be that you live in a downstream community, that there is a forest nearby, that the logs, the trees might have been cut in that forest, which might mean that the risk of flooding gets bigger in your community. So climate change impacts the drivers of risk, but certainly is not the only reason for risks being there. So as a facilitator, what should you be doing when you go into a community? And this is obviously somewhere where the Red Cross has an enormous advantage in being in communities all over the world and having people from those communities talking to other people. So you have a few options here. And I would just like to offer to all of you that all of the options are valid, and you shouldn't feel that you have to take the most complex option to be able to talk about climate change meaningfully. So option A that is mentioned here is don't mention climate change in your context at all with the communities. But what you can do is provide climate information, so information about long-term trends, and maybe a group can provide some additional suggestions here about what type of information you might be able to offer to the facilitators conducting the assessments. So in the Red Cross, we typically work with the VCAs, the Vulnerability Capacity Assessments. So what you can do is make sure that the facilitators are aware of the longer term trends, but when you go to the community, don't tell them about the climate changing. So that is an option, that is an easier one, especially if you're not very confident about what climate change exactly is and how you can deal with it. That's a perfectly valid option. Then there's an option B here with medium difficulty, which talks about facilitating the discussion with the community about changes in the climate by asking questions about weather patterns. So that's what I started talking about earlier. You can have that question, especially with the elders in your community who do remember what things used to be like, and see if you can determine any trends. Now, those trends, again, you can always check with the scientific information if there is a link between them, if they match or not, or it might just be that there are local reasons, maybe a dam was built, which results in more or less flooding in your area. And then here's option C, which is the more difficult one, is where you do introduce climate change and where you help communities understand and prepare for the future by bringing in information about climate change. And this helpfully says see module 3B on how. And there's some practical tips here on how you can do that. And when it says see the module, we're talking about the climate training kit. And I've provided the link to the training kit earlier in the chat. So feel free to look that up, and if you have any questions about that, to follow up with us over the next few days. So if you do discuss the changes with the community, that doesn't need, you don't have to have a PhD in climate science to be able to discuss those changes. What you can just do, as you see in this image, is to sit down and have that conversation and ask a few simple questions. So you could ask, how did you deal with past events? What if these events became more intense and more frequent? What could you do? What could we do differently? And what can the community do to prepare? So sometimes it can be that simple of just thinking about a community risk assessment and thinking, okay, if things were to be more intense, what can we do differently? So when I was in the Philippines a few years ago, I was in a community that said that the year before that, they had had a VCA of someone coming in and doing this risk assessment, and them having drawn up a scenario, a worst case scenario, and saying if in the worst case maybe the water would come up to point B instead of point A, then we should all do X, Y, Z. So we should take actions. And they said it was even worse than that. So what happened following that is that they had rains that were worse than they ever imagined, and they should have prepared for evacuating even higher than what they actually ended up doing. So here, if you do have scientific information about what could happen, what is expected in your community, great. But even just having that conversation about, hey, what did we see years ago, and where do we think this is going, and asking the question, if things become more frequent, more intense, what can we be doing? Should we maybe move up to a higher hill if we're evacuating? That's a really, really great start for most community actions. So what you can do here, what you see here is a matrix to help that analysis. So this is an actual example from the Solomon Islands, where some changes were observed by the community. And rightly speaking, this table asks, are these changes good or bad, or why? So in certain cases, especially if the temperature is increasing in certain cases, it might mean that certain crops might grow all of a sudden that couldn't grow there before. Now that might be something that's very useful for that community. But in this particular case, there's a few examples that are not good for the community. So for example, example 3, it says flooding happens more often. Now, is that a good change? No, it's a bad change. The river rises more quickly and more often these days. And the possible reasons for all of this is that the Met Office reports that there's no change in extreme rainfall events. So that's a possible reason for the change. I wonder if that's a typo or not, actually. In any case, that might mean that there's the flooding might come from somewhere else. So what we see actually here, not a typo, is that there's logging present upstream, probably affecting the flow. So rather than attributing this difference in flooding to climate change, it could be attributed to the logging in a nearby community. Now, does that matter for the community where it comes from? Yes, in addressing it. So it might mean that they have to replant the trees, but at that certain time, they will have to deal with the consequences of flooding as well. So this flowchart is a very brief schematic of how we could think about the information flow. So many of us probably have been involved in VCAs, the Vulnerability Capacity Assessment by the Red Cross, and you can think of that as community information. So that could be a group discussion, you can draw up a seasonal calendar, have a historical profile. There's a whole set of tools that the International Federation of the Red Cross has present on how to do that. That can lead to decision making. It's always great when talking about climate change adaptation, climate resilience action, to also verify that with outside information. So for example, information from the Met Office, the climate change focal point, maybe the long-term trend says that that area is bound to get drier. Now, if that is very valuable information in actually making your plans about where you want to invest your time and your energy in the near future and the longer term future. So you make your decision, and that decision ends up being a community risk reduction plan. And as we heard before, that risk reduction plan can again feed into other processes, into other policies. So one of the things we've seen with Red Cross societies around the world is that the vulnerability assessment information and plans have actually ended up featuring in the national adaptation plans that are national action plans of how to deal with climate change adaptation. So that's a further step that you could take there. Another step that you could consider here is if you do have your community risk reduction plan already and you haven't had the chance of asking people about long-term trends and having that conversation around changes in your community, to take the actions that you've come up with and simply ask the question, what if the hazard that we have identified would be much stronger than anticipated? And then with that thinking in mind, so let's take the example of flooding. If you have drawn up your action plan of building X number of latrines and digging a ditch, for example, and then you ask yourself that question of, okay, so what if the hazard would get worse, what can we do? Then you might consider of actually elevating the latrines or taking other actions, slightly tweaking your already existing action plan to make it more relevant and sustainable for the longer term. So you should ideally cross-check the data from the community with other sources, as I mentioned, and see if they match or not. So if they don't match, you can always try to find an explanation. Maybe that area data is not good in that area. Maybe environmental degradation or changing land use play a role, and that's very useful in deciding your way forward, because you might have to address the root causes of that change, might be the more impactful action to take. And if they are similar, then you also know where your actions, which actions you might be able to take. So in developing your community action plans, what you can do here is thinking, how can we integrate all of that information that we have now gathered, and what the community itself would like to do. So typically this happens through a brainstorm, through a ranking session, and thinking, what can we actually do, and should we again link with other partners to make that more relevant. The next steps are fairly straightforward, following up with the community, seeing what happened to all those plans, because planning obviously is one thing, but taking these steps to an actual implementation is a whole other step, which requires continued support, commitment from the communities, and then you can choose to share that information for advocacy, and that could be very local with your local municipality or your local government, to think if anything needs to change in either the way they have drawn up the law or maybe in how their actual laws are implemented. Here's an example of the Caribbean Climate Change Adaptation Toolkit that I hope all of you will have seen, and maybe Marco can provide a link to this one, which has those steps that I mentioned described in a very clear way about having awareness, doing an assessment, and taking action. With that, I'd like to end the session on community action and what it is you can actually do. But before doing that, it would be great if all of you who are still there can just write down one example action that you think someone can take in a community. And now we're going away from the personal element of it. So it's at the start of our session, we started with, hey, what is something you are doing already? But here, it'd be great if you can type some type of action that you think could be useful in your community. And that's something that we can take further into over the next few days as well. And with that, I would like to pass it back to Rup.
Great, thank you, Margot. Now that we're at the end of our webinar, what I'd like to do is just sum up some of the things that we've spoken about today as you're putting in specific community actions. So as Margot said, we started off by sharing our personal experiences around resilience actions that you've taken so far. And then we described what resilience actions are. So we talked about how they can be anticipatory, they can help to absorb the impacts of climate change, and they can also be adaptive. And then Jeannot also added that advocating for resilience actions is also an important part of one of the things that you can do to build resilience. And then we sort of broadened it out a little bit to sort of understand that resilience actions that you're taking at a very local level or at the national level are actually contributing towards these larger global frameworks. So we have frameworks on disaster risk reduction, on the climate agreement, we have frameworks on sustainable development, and the Red Cross Red Crescent has a really unique role in engaging with these global engagements and helping to implement them at the local level to build resilience. And then we talked about building partnerships. So partnerships are a key way for us to expand the networks that we have to make sure that we have the right information and the right people that can work together to take these resilience actions. So we talked about how the local Met Office might be a key partner, especially in terms of informing you about how risks are changing in terms of whether or not you're having hazards are happening more often or less often, and also for you to anticipate potential hazards in the future. And then Bridget talked about how we can make trainings and workshops that really help people learn about climate change and what are practical things they can do. So we talked about how to pick a topic, how to choose the right participants, and how to really engage participants by using interactive methods, including some of the games that the Climate Center has developed and many of the interactive toolkits that we have available on the Climate Center website that you can access and use in your own work. And then lastly, we had Margot who took us through how we address community risk by integrating things such as what the community has already experienced in terms of changes in the climate. Communities will tell you themselves that that they've been experiencing more hot days, or the seasonal rainfall has changed. So those are things that we can really use as a stepping stone to start addressing those risks. And there are obviously options that you can choose in terms of how you choose to bring in climate change, whether it's in a very direct way or whether it's just using those risks to talk about what sorts of actions can be taken. So we hope that you learned a little bit about resilience actions through this webinar. And of course, we'll be available in the next couple of days to answer questions in the forum. And we're very much looking forward to engaging with you. So I'm going to pass it back to Marco, and I think we'll leave it there.
All right. Thank you very much to all of you. Definitely, I think this was a great presentation. I'm so glad that we actually have this record because I'm sure it will become valuable resources. But yes, just I don't want to take any more of any of you time. So thank you again, and then we'll see you there at the discussion forum. Thanks.